Surprisingly, many people don't even think about a sprint as distinct parts, which can all be worked on together or separately, especially in training. So, you know all about sprinting, right? The extra speed you can gain from an aero position, and how to find your best position, and the optimal technique for sprinting so you don't need to generate 2000 watts to be effective with your power. Well, you've basically got it. There's just one other thing missing: the power. And the reason why sprinters are so fast ultimately comes down to what they can put into their bike and onto the road. And this is partly determined by picking the right parents. However, it also is about developing the necessary power, force, and speed through training. By the way, this is part 3 of a 3-part series on the best way to sprint faster according to science. So if you haven't watched the other parts, I highly recommend that you click here and watch those first. Here's what you need to know about sprint training. Well, let's start with the length of a typical sprint.
Generally, you want to sprint for like 10 seconds and not too much more than that. 12 seconds max. And then I think if you start sprinting more than 12 seconds, you really start fading in the end.
He's right, and this has been shown in papers like this one that found that sprints in professional male races average out to approximately 13 seconds. And of course, there are exceptions, and some people are built for longer sprints. But for a true max effort and effective sprint, we will work with the 2 phases across 10 to 15 seconds. I must admit that the science of road-specific sprint training is not well established. And the process, like many other aspects of training, becomes more trial and error based on what little we do know. And while it might be tempting to go out and just do some variation of 10 to 30 second sprints, because, well, there are plenty of training intervention studies that tell us that there is no problem doing this, like this one or this one, that show a clear benefit not just to sprinting, but also all of your cycling. Or there's even this meta-analysis that shows training sprints can impact your general health. But what I want to talk about is a different approach to sprint training, because I think there is a better way. We can look at the 2 papers I talked about in the technique section, namely this one and this one. They also give us some guidance for dividing up the efforts needed to maximize sprint-specific determinants of performance, which I will reference when talking about the exact sessions I recommend. But I want to start where many people go wrong. They may look at their max and average power numbers of a sprint and think that a high number will equal a fast sprint, and this approach will only lead to disappointment. The issue is that the average power number you produce over a sprint does not account for the 2 different phases, and we'll see why this is important in a moment. But first, let's look at Brion's peak and average sprint power from his win in Stage 1 of the 2023 Region Pays de la Loire Tour. Oh, I really apologize for that. You see, max power is 1384 watts and average power is 1138 watts. And this really doesn't give us enough information to train his sprint, especially because we know that there are 2 distinct parts that have different outcomes. So if you just use these numbers to map his progress, you will miss out on first identifying any weaknesses and second tracking progress of any sprint training. It's better to split the sprint effort up based on the 2 phases that we've talked about previously. As a guideline, I look at the following optimal cadence ranges for each phase. In the power phase, 80 to 100 RPM. In the speed phase, 100 up to 130 RPM. And looking at the average power in the power phase and the average power in the speed phase helps give us some targets to focus on and measure. And I developed a chart in WKO5 to uncover these numbers across the 2 phases. It's important to note here, average is more important than max power for performance and training in sprinting. So if we take the power from the sprint again, and we split across phases, the aim of the training becomes to increase the average power in these cadence ranges before putting it together in a complete sprint. And then you'll have a much better shot at an overall increase in your sprint power and speed. But note here, training in these short durations, it's really hard to aim for these specific power numbers. It's more about the analysis after the efforts and following progress through the sessions. And if you're not hitting new numbers with each repeated sprint session, it might be time to revisit your technique, or even something else might be off. Do some off-bike strength training and look at your recovery, etc. If you are new to this, then start at the power phase and then the speed phase. And once the numbers begin to plateau, shown by clustering, when we are getting repeated numbers over and over again, then we take a stair-step approach. And I would start off with efforts to build the power phase range. And these can be done as standalone efforts or adding to the transition in the power phase range. The power phase is where you must be able to generate large amounts of force in a small amount of time. And this is called rate of force production, RFD. And to have a high RFD, you must have a strong neural coordination. Neural coordination essentially describes how strong the connection between your brain and your muscles, and it strongly influences the magnitude and timing of muscle activation. Specific cycling strength and power training for acceleration, and how I categorize these sessions, and for road cycling sprints, rolling stomps are the best way I know how to do this. Rolling stomps replicate sprinting from 80 to 100 RPM. As an example, a rolling stomp are about generating maximal power on the pedals from lower cadences, and this teaches your body to recruit muscles as efficiently as possible to produce power. And these are done by starting in your biggest gear and then rolling up to 80 RPM and then using your proper technique to accelerate up to 100 RPM. And after that, you're not generating high torque because of the high cadence. And it's a very short effort, so focus on the first few pedal strokes. And if you're looking for more of a challenge, you can start lower at say 60 RPM and aim for 6 to 8 sprints, but a full recovery of 7 minutes walking the bike between efforts. And once you've trained the power range, you simply move up to the next step and work on the speed range in isolation. Generating a high cadence while also controlling form takes patience and practice. Arguably, the most important aspect of a fast sprint is being able to produce a high cadence. And being more specific again, the real power for speed is made over 115 RPM. And this is why a lot of cyclists struggle to sprint well. They never go above 110 RPM, let alone spend time training there. And this is most likely the most under-trained part of a rider's sprint. And this approach to training, this area is similar to the entire stair-step approach. First, we need to generate cadence, and then we add the force. This demands a build-up over time from a lighter gear to a progressively harder one, where you are eventually able to generate a race pace sprint. Here we use sessions that are considered sprint interval speed endurance training. And the aim of these is to improve the ability to maintain sprint velocity for as long as possible. I use the factually correct name of speed endurance intervals, and these are simply 30 seconds at, say, 130 RPM or 60 seconds at 120 RPM with a 10-minute recovery between efforts. Use a gear that allows you to spin up to the RPM range and maintain it throughout most of the effort. Repeat this 6 to 8 times, and the last few seconds should be incredibly challenging. Finally, when you're ready to add speed, it's time for maximal velocity training sessions. And the aim is to reach the highest velocity possible and continue the sprint for as long as the velocity does not decrease. My go-to session is the top speed jumps here, and each jump starts with a seated build up to 100 RPM. Then once you reach 100, you stand up with 100% force until you hit, say, 130 RPM, and then you try and hold that for 5 to 7 seconds. And the goal is to achieve the highest max speed in a complete jump, and then you want 7 minutes recovery between each. Use a normal sprinting gear that allows you to get on top of it and get a high speed. And once you've worked on each of these components individually, it's time to put it all together. Training a complete sprint can include many variations, either alone or with other riders. So coming off a wheel, for example, of another rider by dropping the wheel is a fundamental skill in a bunch sprint. Drills with others hone this skill and the finishing touches to completing your sprint. Out of all the options to practice in a sprint, the only part that I know to be necessary is practicing the kick at the end, because once you hit your max RPM in a road sprint, then you want to try and kick for 2 seconds. And this will give you an edge when it comes to ensuring you cross the line first. This is also a great time to practice the art of the bike throw. Phew, we got through all of that. It was one hell of a deep dive, and although the basic principles of sprinting are relatively simple and governed by the laws of motion, the way you, the athlete, and me as the coach, approach these things like the sprint can make it more complex, but ultimately, this uncovers all of the insights that we have to make you sprint faster.